Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to the most underrated rock albums of 1990. So despite rock being at the tail end of its heyday, the peak period where rock ruled, there was still a lot of great material coming out. And even though these albums are considered underrated today and often overlooked, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were unsuccessful at the time. It's just that they're overlooked by either the fans or the general public as a whole. And I got a bunch of these I want to run through with you guys, and we'll get into it here in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also, leave a comment, hit like. All those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, if you turn on notifications, you'll never miss an episode just like this with the most underrated rock albums of 1990. And yes, we are talking about rock, not metal, not any of the other genres and things like that. Oftentimes people talk about rock as one big overarching thing, but I am sticking to the true definition of the genre here for this. So I'm going to do this in alphabetical order. Obviously, they all came out in 1990, so we're not going to talk about years and stuff like that, which is how I normally order stuff. First up, we've got supergroup Alias, the self-titled debut studio album featuring half of the band as Sheriff and half of the band of the original lineup for Heart. Quite an interesting combination of two musical groups coming together for this album. So the band was formed following a surprise hit of an old Sheriff song for When I'm With You. And that one was unexpected and it rose up the charts, but the band Sheriff had already broken up, so they weren't able to capitalize on it. So frontman Freddie Kersey decided to put together a new band, which would become Alias, to capitalize on that success. And so the lineup is Freddie Kersey on vocals from Sheriff, along with his fellow bandmate Steve DiMarici on guitar. We also have Roger Fisher, Steve Fawson, and Mike Dozier, who are from the original lineup of Heart coming together to round out the band. So I always kind of found that to be a really interesting thing, such a high pedigree of musicians coming together. And despite them having their own big hit in the song More Than Words Can Say, which went all the way to #2 on the Billboard Hot 100, the album itself didn't even, dent, the sales charts or anything like that, and it kind of sunk without a trace. But if you're a fan of melodic rock, AOR, if you're unfamiliar with this band, or you only know that one ballad, don't let that fool you, man. This album really rocks. It's a killer album all the way through, and it's definitely worth checking out as one of the great underrated classics of 1990. All right, next up is power trio King's X, Faith, Hope, Love. Third studio album produced by Sam Taylor, who also worked with ZZ Top. The album is a classic case of being the band's biggest album, ranked very highly among their fans, although fans generally cite Gretchen Goes to Nebraska from 1989 as their best album. But this album as a whole, despite it actually having the band's biggest hit, It's Love, on it, generally goes unnoticed by the general public, the rock community as a whole, which is just an utter sin because the album is so good from start to finish. What's interesting though is that the band is really kind of considered a musician's band, where it has a lot of fans among fellow musicians. I know Jeff Ament of Pearl Jam is a huge fan of the band. And unfortunately, though, beyond that, they don't really get a lot of widespread recognition, making this album here truly one of the underrated classics of 1990. But give this thing a listen. It is so good from top to bottom. You'll see why it should have more recognition. All right, speaking of Pearl Jam, we got a precursor band here in Mother Love Bone Apple, their debut and only studio album. So while the album itself was poised to break big, the band's frontman Andrew Wood died before the album could come out, essentially rendering this album here dead on arrival. Now, two of the members from the band itself would go on to form Pearl Jam. We have Stone Gossard on guitar and Jeff Ament on bass. And due to the success of Pearl Jam and then tribute band Temple of the Dog, which was put together by half of Soundgarden and half of Pearl Jam members to celebrate the life of Andrew Wood, that's effectively kept this band, the name and frontman Andrew Wood in the limelight, at least amongst diehard fans. And so it's one of those things that while it usually gets a mention and it's critically considered, to be this great album, it's never done big sales, had big hits, or anything of that nature. And yet it's just an unfortunate thing because the album itself is so good and really deserves to be considered a much bigger classic than it actually is. All right, next up we got former Led Zeppelin frontman Robert Plant, Manic Nirvana, his 5th studio album. And while being fairly successful at the time, featuring 2 mainstream rock hits, Big Love and Hurtin' Kind, the album itself ultimately sold 500,000 copies. So again, was successful at the time. The album isn't generally mentioned amongst Robert Plant's career. Now, of course, anything amongst his career is going to be overshadowed by his previous band, Led Zeppelin, and all his efforts that he did there. And his previous album, Now and Then, in 1988, which was a 3 million selling album. If they're going to mention something of the solo years, oftentimes it goes to that. But unfortunately, Robert doesn't even promote this album or really anything from his early days as a solo artist when he's playing live, and he sticks mostly to the late 90s and beyond in terms of the folk rock stuff that he does today, which I think is a big contributing factor as to why an album like this, as well as most of his solo works, just go unnoticed and are considered underrated albums. But again, definitely worth checking out. Next up, we got former Stooge Iggy Pop, Brick by Brick, 9th studio album produced by Don Was. While the album was considered successful at the time, having had a little bit of success here and there on it, even having 2 fairly well-known hits in the day, minor hits, if you will, Home and Candy, which featured Kate Pearson of the B-52s. And she, became even more famous after this, but really helped to put that song into the limelight at the time. Overall, though, the album itself hasn't really held up against fans and is often considered, overlooked and underrated. The album itself would only peak at 90 on the Billboard 200 album chart and not reach any sort of sales certifications. And like other albums from the 90s, though, there were a lot of guests on it, which maybe is one of the reasons why it stands out for me. Having contemporary artists on here sort of paying homage to Iggy Pop. We had Slash and Duff McKagan of GNR on here, Waddy Wachell on guitar from Stevie Nicks' band, Kenny Aronoff on drums from John Mellencamp's band, John Hyatt on vocals, and of course the aforementioned Kate Pearson on vocals from the B-52s. But even all of that on here doesn't keep this album up there amongst all the others of Iggy Pop. You often hear other albums get cited as the great Iggy albums, and of course they always go back to the Stooges material. But I think that's a real shame because this album here is a really solid effort, albeit it's in a hard rock vein and not typical to the other stuff that he did. So it's probably one of the reasons that the album itself is often overlooked. Okay, next one. Glam metal icons Rat, Detonator, their 5th studio album produced by Sir Arthur Payson, who was the right-hand man of Desmond Child, who also co-wrote the album, and in my opinion is really what elevated this album, taking it beyond just a standard Rat album. The last album to feature the original lineup of the band itself, and while not as successful as previous albums, it would sell 500,000 copies, and that's one of the things I've been talking about here, where some of these were successful at the time, but then in retrospect, people don't look at them the same way. I think it was expertly written and is head and shoulders above other albums. Not that the other albums aren't great, but I just really love this one here. Warren DeMartini's guitar riffing on this is exceptionally prominent on this album. Really crisp, really clear, stands out. And in 34 years that I've been listening and collecting music and all of that, since this one came out here, I really have never gotten tired of this. It's got 2 classic singles on it, Lovin' You's a Dirty Job and Shame, 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 but there's some real cool, deep album cuts that excel and put this thing above, just the standard album like All or Nothing, Can't Wait on Love, and Giving Yourself Away. I love those songs. But unfortunately, this album just doesn't hold up, it seems to be, amongst fans and the general public, and is often considered to be a very underrated album. But I have heard some of you guys, comment when I've talked about this album, because it's not the first time I've brought it up, but that you guys like this one too. All right, moving on, we got American rock band REO Speedwagon, The Earth, A Small Man, His Dog, and a Chicken, and I have no idea what that title means. I wondered where the heck it came from. It's probably some tongue-in-cheek inside joke at the time. But 13th studio album, and it was the final for a major label, their label being Epic Records at the time. First without two longtime members. Gary Richrath left, he was on guitar, and Alan Gratzer on drums, who also left. Taking over guitar and drum duties went to Dave Amato and Brian Hitt, who are still with the band today, and I thought that was kind of cool that the two guys they brought in 1990 are still with them 34 years on, keeping a very solid lineup for the band. It was also the only album to feature keyboardist Jesse Harms, who's known for working with Sammy Hagar. And he co-wrote or wrote half of the album here, and I think one of the big reasons why I like this album so much. And so while there were a lot of changes, obviously, going into this album between member changes, co-writing, who wrote the album, I think it's still a really solid effort. Unfortunately, none of the singles, though, translated into success, causing it to be their first album from 1978 to not be certified for a sales milestone. But that's not to say this album isn't really good. Personally, I think it's one of their best albums. It's my favorite album of theirs. I reach for this thing more than I do their biggest album, High Infidelity. I think that says something right there. Next up, we got Pump Rock Heroes, Styx, Edge of a Century, 12th studio album, reunion album minus Tommy Shaw, who is in the Damn Yankees, having his own success over there, featuring new member Glenn Burtnick coming in, and the last album to feature drummer John Panazzo before his untimely death. And so, despite not having Tommy Shaw involved in the lineup, the band still had a #3 Billboard Hot 100 hit with the second single, Show Me the Way, which I think is an absolute beautiful song. It's a thing that drew me to this album here. But unfortunately, that's not enough to really keep this album in people's minds. And the album itself might also kind of be considered to not rank so highly because it was really driven by Dennis DeYoung, and it was an album for which he took charge, and so the whole of the thing really became more of his album than, say, a band effort. But I think the album is really strong, and since I guess Dennis not being part of it too, the current lineup of Styx does not promote this, and so it doesn't stay registered in the minds of people today. And unfortunately, it's a real shame because I think there's a lot of high caliber songs on this that are definitely worth taking note of due to how underrated this album is. All right, next up we got the godfather of grunge himself, Neil Young and Crazy Horse, Ragged Glory, 6th studio album with Crazy Horse, 20th solo album overall from Neil Young. While the album itself didn't have any overt hits on it the way previous album Freedom did with Rockin' in the Free World, it did return Neil to that classic sound that I think he made so famous and he hadn't done in nearly a decade's time. 1981 Reactor, which was another Crazy Horse album, was kind of the last time that he'd really rocked out that hard with that defining, distorted sound. But for me, this album is really consistent all the way through. It sounds great. It has quality songs. It was a good return to form in terms of the nature of what it is that he does so well. And I'm constantly amazed that due to all of that, it doesn't rank higher for most fans, making it another very underrated album amongst not only Neil's career, but just in the rock world in general. All right, and the last one to touch on here, and the reason I'm wearing this ZZ Top shirt, we got that little old band from Texas, ZZ Top Recycler, 10th studio album, and a culmination of a 3-album trilogy that the band had done, perfecting the sound that they started way back on Eliminator, 1983, continued through Afterburner, 1985, which for me always sounded a bit dated, but for this album here, I think they were able to finally, meld those sounds together and create a classic sound. The album itself features the song Double Back, which was from the movie Back to the Future 3, so that's burned into my brain. The band even makes a cameo in that movie and apparently did a whole bunch of jamming on set while cameras were down and stuff. I'd love to get a hold of that footage because I hear that they played for, an hour or so or 2 hours or something ridiculous like that. But the cameras were repaired and began rolling. They just didn't want to stop because they were having so much fun with the band. But despite the album having 4 fairly big rock radio hits in the song Give It Up, My Head's in Mississippi, Burger Man, and Concrete and Steel. Despite all of that, the album itself is often overlooked. When I talk about it, I know I always get, crazy shock from people that I think this is the best ZZ Top album. Not that I don't like the earlier stuff that they did. It's just, this was my introduction into the band, my first ZZ Top album that came out while I was into the group. And that in and of itself makes this album, often overlooked. It's one that doesn't really translate. People often cite Eliminator or, jump on or even, completely ignore the 80s and early 90s era and go back to the stuff that the band became most famous for in the 70s. And I get that. But for me, at least, this is definitely ZZ Top's most underrated album, but also one of the most underrated albums of the 90s. And there you go, 10 of the most underrated rock albums of the 90s. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. There's a ton of other great albums that came out in the same year, but I tried to distill it down to these 10 classics, in my opinion, that even if you don't know these or you've always bypassed these would, really be worth your time in checking out. All right, everyone. Take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.